We're continuing along with the Sermon on the Mount, and there's some, in some ways, just going from one topic to another. So last time we talked about hatred and calling somebody a fool. We're saying raka, things like that. And now when we segue to verses 23 through 26, he talks about how differences that can then affect our worship as well. So we're going to be looking at verses 23 through 26 to start us out. Nancy, do you mind reading that for us? 23 through 26.
Okay. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First, go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you are still together on the way, or your adversary may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny.
All right, thank you. So it connects worship then with your relationship with your brother or sister. And first question it has there is, how can you help someone with someone's righteous anger? If somebody is righteously angry at you, how can you help them through that, so to speak? If somebody is angry at you for good reason, you guys see where we're at? Yeah, with the righteous anger, they have a good reason. Yeah. Great. So if they do have something and it's a righteous reason to be angry at you, you listen to them, but you also say what? I'm sorry. Yeah, it really de-escalates to something when you actually say, yeah, it was my fault, I'm sorry. Yeah, right. George. Yeah. Right. And so it really, that's a good point, because in the verse, Jesus tells you to be the aggressor in that case, in the sense that if somebody's got something against you, you go to them, don't make them come to you, right? Sometimes if you know somebody's angry at you, you don't say anything and you kind of get quiet because maybe you said something or did something and you don't want to talk to them. But this says go and do it. Go and talk to them. Be the first one to apologize to them and kind of try to de-escalate the situation there. What's that? Be the instrument. And if you don't, it just festers on you. Right, it festers on you also. Right, so I forgot to, you can hear me online okay?
Yes.
All right, I usually use this microphone. I'm going to try to plug this in and ruin everything, so we'll see how that works. All right. Can you still hear me okay?
Yes.
Much better.
All right. I feel like a rock star now, so.
You look like
Okay, 23. Okay, so what does your offering at church have to do with your brother's anger against you? How come he relates those two things? Do we need an extra one of these? Yeah, the old ones.
I have an extra one. You need?
This one, Kathy, just have Gina make a copy for you.
Sorry.
Or wait. Oh, he's got one. All right, we're good.
I have my last one.
It's fine. So what does your offering at church have to do with your brother's anger at you? You know, why does he say, go settle there before you give your offering?
I think that's the same way with Cain and Abel. When God didn't really accept Cain's offering, he gave an offering.
Right.
But there was something back there that was causing problems, and so therefore the way it was given wasn't.
Right. Cain and Abel is a good example of that, right? Yeah, Mike?
How can you show your love to God with an offering if you add something to himself if you can't reconcile it with your brother who is here with you?
Okay. So your reconciliation with God has to do with your reconciliation with other people, right? That's a secondary sign of your relationship towards God, right? Mm-hmm.
Pastor?
Well, yeah, you wouldn't want them to think you're kind of trying to buy your way to heaven by going and giving an offering when you've offended them. That's an interesting thought. Yeah, Nancy.
Possibly you're hindering someone else from worshiping.
Yeah, that's a good point too, because if they see you worshiping and everything as if you're in a greater relationship with God when you've harmed them and you haven't done anything to them, that might cause them not to worship then. Yeah, so it might have things with them also. Yeah, so we oftentimes associate, right, our worship with God with our conscience too, don't we? You know, so those are all good answers. How you concern yourself with guilt towards others reflects how you are concerned with your guilt towards God, right? So sins aren't done in a vacuum. They're done against people whom God has placed in your life. So if you have a disregard for people, you also have a disregard for God, right? So, you know, a lot of times there's an attitude towards people in today's life where we say, I don't care what they think of me. And there's some benefit to that in that you don't drive your life by what other people think of you or do it for a popularity contest. But in the same sense, these are people who see you as a child of God. And God says to let your light shine before men. So if you really don't care what people think of you, that's not a completely pious attitude to have either when you're trying to reflect the love of God in your life. So you don't just say things and do things just because you don't care, when God does tell you to care. As far as it concerns you, live at peace with everyone, he says. So there's a happy medium there with it, like with everything, okay? Okay, so then he goes off on this. He says, settle matters quickly and do it while on the way, or your adversary may hand you over to the judge will hand you over to the officer. You won't get out until you've paid the last penny. Until you've paid the last penny. So in human terms, what might happen is he trying to say? That people are very what? Judgmental, but also very merciless too, right? They aren't going to let you get out till you pay the last penny. So you don't want to be put in that kind of a situation on this side of heaven either, in a sense. And you know, you think about that when Jesus is talking about apologizing to somebody on this side of heaven because they won't let you get out till you've paid the last penny. How do you compare that to the way God deals with us? God treats us.
You may not have that chance.
Okay, when you die, if you don't, before you die, right? Is he the same way that he won't let you get out of judgment until you've paid the last penny?
He paid the last penny.
Because you can't, right? And because he paid the last penny, right? So it's a different system with God, isn't it? We still apologize out of thankfulness that he did pay the last penny.
We're going to go forward, not wanting to do it again.
Yeah, right. When you realize how much you owed him, and remember the parable of the guy who chokes his servant after he was forgiven for a lot less, right? Hey, EJ?
Is this where Catholics get purgatory?
Where he pays the last penny.
I guess I don't need to ask that, but
Um,
that's where I thought.
Is that where Catholics get purgatory? Sue's not here. She could answer that one for me.
Doesn't matter.
It might be. I know they also use that one with getting through. I don't know if we talked about that on Sunday or last week about going through the flames for a false teacher, going through the flames, how he gets out, but as one escapes through the flames. And I can't remember where we talked about that last, but I think they use that flame one for a purgatory reference, I guess. And then they usually reference an apocryphal book too. Okay. George.
Is that not to get off on the Catholic thing, but is that a biblical thing that they go by or a folk thing?
Well, it's a verse taken out of context for one thing, and then it's an apocryphal book is the one that was written after the Bible or in between the Bible and the Old Testament and the New Testament that they reference, and I don't remember which book they reference there. So I don't think it's necessarily a Pope thing. It's a Catholic teaching thing, but I don't know that it was directly came down from the Pope. Okay. Let's see here. So Psalm 49 says, no man can redeem the life of another or give to God a ransom for him. The ransom for a life is costly. No payment is ever enough. And, you know, if we're going to try to get before God and apologize so that we don't have to pay the last penny, that's not the way God works, obviously, right? He pays the last penny. And none of payment of ours is
And
enough,
I
Mary.
guess that's a good thing to know, because there are religions who say you can pay for somebody else's.
Yeah,
I mean, and basically the Catholic Church says that, because they take all the offerings you do for stuff after.
Mhm.
I don't know how much they do it now, but that used to be a thing.
Yep.
Where you could, and here it says directly, you can't do that.
Right.
I mean, this verse positively states that.
right. Within Catholicism, they make a distinction between temporal punishments and then purgatory punishments, probably, and eternal punishment. Purgatory punishments, they say, are for good things so that you recognize your sin. Okay, I'm talking in Catholic thinking. So they might distinguish that what they call works of supererogation. Erogation is work, supererogation is works above and beyond what you were supposed to arrogate, okay? So if you had a saint who was really, really good, he could put this in the treasury of the saints. And then if they did these extra works which you failed and you paid for them, so to speak, then that can get transferred to your account to lessen some time in purgatory. But Luther's thinking was, if purgatory is supposed to be a good thing to purge you of your guilt and to make you recognize your sin, then why would you want to pay to get out of it? So, but that's all within Catholic thinking, right? They have penalties that are imposed upon the members of the church by the church, and then there are penalties imposed by God. So it's kind of a complicated system in a sense, how it works. Mike, did you have something?
I was just talking about indulgences that they used to sell them. They
Yeah.
might have sold them after.
There was actually another indulgence in the year 2000. I think they called it a year of Jubilee indulgence that they actually advertised on the Catholic website. So they still, yeah. Yep. So just wasn't well known out there. The last penny is literally the last quadrans. The quadrans was a coin worth a fraction of an agricultural worker's daily wages. So that's what he actually said in there with the Greek. So now any other questions on 23 through 26? He's basically emphasizing that if you've given somebody a reason to get angry, don't mess with that. From a temporal point of view and also from a spiritual point of view, right? Don't let people have reason to be angry with you. Look for reasons to say, I'm sorry. And I think that's also a big part of the 12-step program, is that you go and apologize to people that you've hurt through your alcoholism or whatnot, if I remember correctly. The 6th step, okay. So, all right. Which is a good thing, right? It's a hard thing to do, but it's a good thing. So the interesting thing though, yeah, if you don't make mistakes, it's pretty easy. That's true. Yes. So what do most people think of when they hear the word adultery? If you just throw that term out, what do they usually think of? Cheating out your spouse, right? But the way Jesus is going to describe this now in 27 through 30, he's really digging the law in. And so here we see Jesus teaching in a way that's taking the law and just hammering us with it, right? So that we realize we need him, the pure one, in our place again. So people can look at this Sermon on the Mount and say how legalistic it is, or it's all law, and there is a lot of law there, but we always remember the one who's speaking, and we find the gospel in the one who's going to fulfill it for us, right? So let's look at verse 27. First of all, Matthew 5, verse 27. Let's see. Dave, you want to read that for me? Can you see it up there?
Yep. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery.
All right. So first of all, I had the question in your notes. Who was Jesus talking against here? That would be primarily the Pharisees or the teachers of the law, right? What had they heard was said? And that's in the commandments, right? 6th commandment, the way we number them in the Lutheran Church. Where would they have heard this? In the law of Moses, right? In the Old Testament. How did they limit this law? What did they limit it to? What was adultery in their mind? Yeah, the outward act, like we said, right? If you're cheating on somebody physically, right? Okay. Luther said, look at what the condition of this people must have been and what kind of people Christ must have faced. Not only the great and common mob, but even their superiors, teachers, and rulers permitted such things and committed them themselves. They made adultery easier, and yet they wanted a reputation for piety as long as they did not actually commit overt adultery. It's easy to figure out how pious and chaste people can remain in their works if they're permitted to go so far that their heart is brimming over with lust, and that they express this to one another in all sorts of signs, words, and gestures, okay? Do the preachers and teachers limit this law today?
What do you mean limit this law?
Just saying the only adultery is when you cheat, when you actually...
Say yes.
Some do, I'm sure, right? Yeah, yeah. It depends on what kind of a church you're going to, I guess you would say, right? So let's read verse 28 now. Read verse 28. Kathy, can you see that?
Well, pretty good. But I tell you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart.
All right, so what does Jesus include under the sin of adultery? Lust, right. Why do you suppose Jesus singles out the male?
Because he's visual.
He is visual oriented. Yeah. So women aren't visual?
Oh, yeah, I
Yeah.
suppose. Not a woman right now.
You're choosing not to be one at the moment. Yeah, so generally speaking, although when you think about pornography and things like that, it has more recently become a problem with women as well. Primarily, it's been more of a problem with men than with women in an overall percentage. So he says, even looking at somebody lustfully has committed adultery with her in his heart. So we try and apply this a little bit. Should adults be permitted to watch more questionable shows because they're better at filtering out the right from the wrong than a little child? That doesn't necessarily float, does it? Is it wrong for a husband to look at another woman and think she is a very pretty lady? It's no and yes.
Boy, I don't know. She's a pretty, I mean, I heard both sides of that from Steve.
Mhm.
How can you not look at a beautiful woman and say she's beautiful?
Okay. How can you not say that?
Like movie stars, if you look at them, they are beautiful.
Okay.
If somebody, no matter who says it, they are beautiful.
So
Don't say this to them, I'm sorry, I mean,
I don't know. Let's say that his wife is standing right there.
oh, that's hurtful. No.
That's hurtful then?
Not even that.
Well, it depends, if it's a movie star.
Okay. You say if it's a movie.
If she's beautiful, she's beautiful.
Okay. So let's say if it's just to his buddy, she's a beautiful woman. Anything wrong with that?
My wife.
If she didn't hear you.
Oh, well, should I say something that I don't want her to hear anyway?
Well, you don't, I mean, we do say things to different people.
What's my intent? What am I feeling in my presence
If
about?
some woman is blessed with like beautiful skin, beautiful teeth, beautiful hair, you say, well, that's a pretty woman. I can see anything wrong with that.
Okay, so you don't think there's anything wrong.
If a
Okay.
guy says that about a woman, you know,
Okay, only if he's talking about her teeth?
no, I'm just
Oh,
saying,
oh,
she
yeah.
says,
Yeah.
God, all kinds of creation is beautiful.
Okay, all right.
I think it is what is in intent in your heart.
Yeah.
I mean, my daughter is dressed up and she looks beautiful, and I mean that in a
Right. So you're not lusting towards your daughter if you say she looks beautiful, right? So,
right?
okay. George,
What's the book of the Bible?
Song of Songs?
Yeah,
Who's he talking about?
huh?
Who's he talking about?
His wife.
Well, his wife to be or his wife, yes, yeah. So, you know, but yeah, it does mention beauty there, right? Luther says he does want us to distinguish between looking and lusting. You may look at any woman or man only to be sure that you do not lust. That is why God has ordained for every person to have his own wife or husband to control and channel his lust and his appetites. If you do not go any further than this, he approves it. He even pronounces his blessing upon it, and he's pleased with it. That's what Luther says. Now, he's not God, but that's his opinion. So how can you tell the difference between the two? How do you know whether you're looking or lusting?
Because you know.
Yeah. How do you know?
Because if you're lusting, you feel it.
Okay. Yeah. Kathy, what were you going to say? Or was that Mary talking? You know in your heart. Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah. You hope you know, but your heart is very deceitful. God's word says it's more deceitful than the man can cure, right? So, yeah. So, you might make a distinction between leering at somebody and thinking things you shouldn't think versus just looking and saying that's a beautiful person. But it's careful. It's something you got to be careful for. Luther says, when a man doesn't look at his wife, and when instead he turns his gaze to another woman, this is the principal cause of adultery, which then is almost inevitable. Soon the heart follows the eyes, bringing on the desire and appetite that I ought to reserve for my wife alone. With the devil's promptings, a person sees only his wife's faults, losing sight of her good and laudable qualities. As a consequence, every other woman seems more beautiful and better to my eyes than my own wife. Indeed, many a man with a truly beautiful and pious wife lets himself be hoodwinked into hating her and taking up with some vile and ugly bag. Spoken only like Luther could say, right? So what does Luther point to as a positive remedy to lust?
Marriage.
Not just close your eyes. Look at your own wife and look at her qualities, not at her negatives, right? So try and look at her. And so it's the art of looking at your spouse correctly, according to the beauty and adornment with which God has clothed her for you, or him for you. So look at him as the most dearest treasure and loveliest ornament you can find in a woman, and vice versa. All right? Nice little saying there. All right. So let's look at John. John used to buy swimsuit issues of Sports Illustrated. He also bought Penthouse magazine. His mom didn't like it. He told her, I mainly just read the articles. I don't look at the pictures in the Penthouse. I can look at the swimsuit issues. It's just like going to a beach. I'm just admiring God's creation. I'm not lusting. At least I'm not going to strip joints. Okay? So what are John's excuses?
His sin's not as bad as ours.
Okay. He could be doing worse, right? Some other sins that he's committing?
That's a very old joke.
Lying.
That I only buy the Playboy for the other.
Yeah, I only buy it for the article. Yep. Lying is his excuse, yes.
Well, you were supposed to be preaching the word with your actions too. Johnny has people looking at him that he's witnessing to. This is not a good way to be.
Wouldn't be a good witness to people, right? Did you have an extra Bible study there yet for Laura? We're not on that one yet. So, well, you can keep it. That'll be next. So, EJ will show you where we're at there. Why aren't John's excuses acceptable? Well, you look at the next two verses, right? What does God tell us to do with, in the first verse, what does he tell us to do? Yeah, so is that an appearance of evil if you got a penthouse in your house? Yes. And what does he also say in 2 Timothy 2? Flee the desires of youth, right? So are you fleeing it if you're putting it right in front of you in a magazine and saying you're reading the articles in between the nudie pictures?
No.
Yeah, probably not. So those are some examples of different excuses people use and some of the struggles that they have. How is Jesus' explanation of adultery very practical in a sense? He says, if your right eye is causing you to sin, what should you do? Pluck it out. Now, you might say it's not very practical, but what's the point he's getting at? How do you deal with the weed? What do you got to do with the weed? Pull it out by the root, right? So that's his point, isn't it? Get lower so it try to get rid of if you're really concerned about adultery, then get rid of the thoughts that might lead to adultery, right? So as opposed to our world that says give everybody what they want, as long as they're not doing something bad, if they're only thinking about it, you know. You have this battle then with child pornography, right? Which leads to other sins, right? So some people might excuse that because they're only looking at it, but children were exploited for that also, right? So the way that this sin works is it's progressive, right? It gets worse and worse. If one thing doesn't make you happy, then you progress to the next and the next. And that's why sometimes you wonder about people. If that's not a struggle for you, you would say, how does somebody think that that's attractive or whatever? Well, it doesn't happen overnight. It's a hardening of the heart towards one sin, then another sin, then another sin. And so if one thing would have satisfied you at one time, well, it didn't really satisfy you, then you got to go to a worse and a worse sin, and more vile one. Mike?
The funny thing, I don't mean funny, but children that do good abuse like that turn out to be abusers like that themselves.
Yeah.
And it just propagates the sin over and over.
It can, yeah. Not all the time, but yes, yeah. And
Pastor?
in a lot of other ways too. Yes.
Just like marijuana was always thought as the gateway drug into harder drugs, looking is the gateway into worse things within pornography.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's a gateway. Exactly. It's a good way of putting it. Just like marijuana can be for other drugs. Yes, that's true. So let's see here. Now the question is, how far do I have to go in fleeing the evil desires of youth? This is the question that's addressed next in verses 29 through 30. Jesus goes on to give a very vivid illustration as to what he's talking about. So we go to 29 through 30. Somebody want to read? Deb, you want to read that one for me right away?
Okay. From the Bible, right? Mine is a little bit different, 29 to 30. If your right eye causes you to fall into sin, pluck it out and throw it away from you. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. I'm reading till where?
30.
Okay. If your right hand causes you to fall into sin, cut it off and throw it away from you. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than your whole body to be thrown into hell.
All right. Thank you. So the word for fall into sin is skandalidzai in the Greek. The New NIV has stumble for that. What does Jesus recommend be done if something causes you to sin? Get rid of it. Cut it off, right? Is he serious? So if this was literal, what would most of us be doing here? Walking around with what? Yeah. We wouldn't have any hands. We wouldn't have any eyes, we wouldn't have any feet. So what's the point he's making? Well, it is serious, right? And ultimately, if you're going to go deeper than the eye and deeper than the hand, what's deeper than that in the body?
Your
The heart. And then what are you going to have to do with your heart? Rip out your heart and your brain, right? And so what would you end up being? Dead, right? So then if you think about the whole concept of conversion and what God has to do with us, in order to make us live, he has to, first of all, put us to death, right? So Christianity is not just a matter of making better choices in life, It's not even a matter of being able to think better. God's going to have to put you to death. And where does he do that? And how does he do it? On the cross. And then he applies that death to you in your baptism, right? He puts you to death in your baptism, brings you to life through faith, keeps you alive through the Lord's Supper. So Christianity is not just I'm going to put on a tie and I'm going to act a little better today kind of a religion. It's a death and life religion. And so when we're coming before God on Ash Wednesday, we got the ashes on our forehead, and what are we saying? You're to dust, and to dust you'll return. And we go to him through repentance and faith. Put me to death, Lord. Put me to death. Put all my desires to death. Kill my will so that your will can be done. And that's a deadly thing for us. It crucifies us of our will, of our desires, and then it replaces us with God's desires. And so that's how it ultimately has to work. It's very extreme, isn't it? It's not just a try-hard religion. And I think sometimes we forget that, right? This isn't going to be a 10 steps to being a Christian type of a sermon. He's talking about plucking out your eyes and chopping off your hands, and that's not that's an extremist type of a thing. Mike?
There's a good movie, I think John Travolta stars in, maybe called Shylock or something, and it talks about repaying a debt, and then the judge tells them, you want a pound of flesh. They're taking a pound of flesh. And if it's off a little bit, we're gonna take a little more.
Okay. John Travolta movie, what was it, Saturday Night Fever? Shylock, or Pound of Flesh, okay. I never heard of that one. So there's another neat one that talks about guilt. It's with Robert De Niro. I think it's called The Missionary or something like that, or The Mission, and he's got to walk around with this big bag of garbage on his back because he murdered somebody. And he's walking up this hill, he's all full of mud, he's worn out, and then the priest that made him wear this, I think, takes this axe and chops it off, and it goes flying down this hill, and he just bursts out into tears. You know, it's really a neat picture of God's forgiveness. But somebody should Google that while we're sitting here. John Travolta, Shiloh, you think it's Shylock?
I think that's what they call surrenders.
Yeah, the Jewish.
Oh, all right. All right, Shylock. So Matthew 15 is kind of the cross-reference there, right? Out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, slander. These are what make man unclean. So ultimately, getting rid of these sins is a deadly business. Luther says, in this case, we'd have to take our own life and everyone would commit suicide. If we're supposed to throw away everything that offends us, first we have to tear out our heart. But in your heart and in the presence of God, that is where you throw away your eye and your hand, deny yourself and forsake all. Here's what Christ means. If you feel that you're looking at a woman with an evil desire, pluck out that eye or that look, since it's forbidden by God, not out of your body, but out of your heart, from which your lust and appetite proceed. Then you have really plucked it out. And you think then about also the addictive nature of pornography, how it actually intertwines with your brain. The rush that you get is kind of like a drug addiction, and people become addicted to that. So just, you know, it's really hard for people to addict to that stuff to get rid of it in a sense. And you got to cut that stuff off from your view. So that's where the internet is so hard, because, you know, it used to be for a young kid to see something like that, he'd have to maybe find his perverted old father's underneath his bed or something and find something like that. But now it's just right on his phone, popping up there saying, hey, free, just go to this website, bang, and parents have no idea what's going on. So the devil knows this stuff. He does. How does this preach against the cloister and the monastery or the holy community idea? If I want to get rid of sin in my life, I join a cloister or a monastery.
That isn't what God said.
It won't work, right? Why not? Because you're bringing yourself along for the process, right? Now, there is something to be said for having good character. God's word says, don't be misled. Bad company corrupts good character. But you can't think that you're going to get rid of sin by cloistering yourself off. Then you get all kinds of other strange sins that happen in these little communities and things like that, you know.
Yeah, we want to stay away from sin. We can just smell blood through our whole life.
Yeah, yes. And but that's not what God calls us to do, right? So, yeah. So is it wrong to go to beaches or watch perverted TV shows?
They're connected.
What's that?
I mean, those two things don't necessarily go together, right?
Not necessarily. Depends on what beach you're going to, probably. Maybe.
You can accidentally go to a bad one. Sarah always tells about the time they ended up in Chicago on a new beach that they didn't know they had.
Yeah.
Because somebody told them that was so nice at that beach. So they went there, and here was a new beach, and in Chicago.
Yeah, I wouldn't expect that to be in Chicago. She's talking about her daughter that went to a nude beach in Chicago. So it's a little cold for nude beaches in Chicago. So, you know, you think about some of the TV shows that come on, and some of them have really good stories and everything, but nowadays you're watching one with a good plot. And usually in the old days, if they're working up to a sexual scene, they kind of work up to it. But nowadays, if you're watching something they switch over to a sexual scene just like that, and you don't even have time to hit a button or anything. It's there in front of you, you know. I didn't watch the TV show Game of Thrones, but I've heard that there's a lot of, like in the beginning of the series, there's a lot of sexual scenes in there and stuff that's using sex to sell, so to speak, with a very good story in the background, but
it's porn.
it is porn.
I mean,
Yeah.
I started it too, and it started out great, and trying to get through and go low, but it's, crazy.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, and I say that, they're showing blood anymore, it's just,
I don't know about that, it was bloody murder, there was sex.
Yeah, yeah, so,
About the whole thing from my wife for Christmas.
Oh.
And seeing it.
yeah. Yeah, so those are things that happen, right? So you gotta be careful with that, obviously. What about when a man and woman are dating? Is it wrong for them to desire and love each other?
no.
Well, I would hope not, right? But of course you have the temptation there to go too quickly in a relationship, obviously, with something like that. So, you know, otherwise everybody would have to flee marriage if, you know, or we'd go to the Eastern version of marriage where you just get set up and you don't even see the person until you're you know, mom or dad says you're marrying this person and that's it. But that doesn't work too hot either. EJ.
I maybe should apologize for saying it's porn, but if I was sitting there with my teenage kid and what I saw popped up, if I was a teenager, I would have been, whoa, you know.
Right.
Maybe an adult can watch it and, you know, well, I've never seen that, whatever. I don't think it was done for that, but I better be careful because I know it's a big thing. I don't want to.
Well, that was
to the masses, but there was, when I was watching it at first, it was a very good show.
that was the question that was asked before. Is it okay for an adult to watch it but not a kid if you've seen it before? You
That's
know.
what it does to you, I think.
Yeah.
You know, in my opinion, I think it's.
Depends on what it does to you.
Yeah.
George.
I think also language,
Mm-hmm.
there are so many shows.
Language.
And
Yeah.
Mary and I will be sitting and you almost get numb to it.
Oh, you do get numb. You don't almost get numb to it. You do get. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
You hear that
Right.
on everything.
So
Any theory you watch.
there was a case a few years ago where this guy flipped off his tube in the middle of a lake and he was yelling out these cuss bombs and somebody actually called the police and he was fined for vulgarity. And people were thought on Rifle River that was? Okay. Cussing canoer. Okay. So I would be shocked if they actually did anything like that today because you can be walking through the middle of Meyer or something and people are cussing left and right, you know?
Or they have it on their shirt.
They have it on their shirts, yeah. Anyway, we're kind of going off on a soapbox here.
You become numb to it.
You do become numb, and that's the point, that you don't want to become numb to it. Will we ever be able to stop the thoughts from coming?
No.
Probably not, but sometimes, you know, your hormones or whatever you have inside you slow down with older age sometimes, you know, so you're not driven by those thoughts as much maybe the older you get.
I don't know, they're dirty old men.
There are dirty old men too, yeah, yeah. So how do we get rid of them? You can't necessarily get rid of them ultimately, but what can you do? Limit yourself to them and resist them, right? By limiting yourself to them, and when you have the thoughts, trying to fight against them, right? Not accepting them.
And don't justify it by saying, oh, Jesus forgives me.
Try not, yeah, don't justify your thought process, right? So you can't keep a bird from flying over your head, but you can certainly keep it from nesting in your hair or biting your nose off. So it isn't in our power to prevent this or some other temptation and to keep the thoughts from occurring to us. Just be sure that you let it go and don't let them in, even though they knock on the door. So that's the point, isn't it? That you resist them. So Jesus is really laying the hammer down on adultery to the Pharisees and teachers of the law who didn't seem to see a problem with it too much, right? Any other comments or questions on adultery? Okay, let's get to divorce then. Mary Herbst, do you want to read that for me?
It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for marital, in unfaithfulness, causes her to become an adulteress. And anyone who marries the divorced woman commits adultery.
Okay. Now you said anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery, right? And what was the, could you read 32 again for me? Sorry.
But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for marital unfaithfulness, causes her to become an adulteress.
All right, causes her to become an adulteress. You notice the EHV says causes her to be regarded as an adulteress. And then keep reading.
And anyone who marries the divorced woman commits adultery.
Commits adultery. So you see the distinction in the translation. In the NIV, she's committing the adultery, or he's committing the adultery. In the EHV, she's regarded as one. You have the NIV 84 version, I believe. The 2011 version says makes her the victim of adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So there they have a committing adultery, but being the victim of adultery. Okay, so there's a little distinction there in how you translate that. First of all, the question is, where was it said that you could just give a certificate of divorce?
Back in the Bible.
It wasn't only in the culture, it was also in the Bible, in Deuteronomy 24, actually. This was from Deuteronomy 24. How come divorce was more permissible to the Old Testament than it is now? It's kind of a loaded question in a sense.
I think he still hated it. It was something he allowed. He didn't okay it.
Okay, so that word okay is kind of a loaded question. Yeah, EJ said he allowed it, but it wasn't that he okayed it. Nancy, what were you going to say?
They said Moses allowed it because of the hardness of their hearts.
Yeah, so that's not exactly a compliment, is it?
No.
If I allow something because of the hardness of the heart, it's not that I want it or I even like it. So you have to remember that Moses is not only dealing with the people as in a church, but as a whole country too, right? So they had these laws that were there that did permit things that weren't what God wanted either. So you think of the difference between church and state. Moses was a state leader. Divorces were allowed in the state so that people wouldn't kill each other too, in a sense. So Luther says Christ is not functioning here as a lawyer or a governor to set down or prescribe any regulations for outward conduct, but he is functioning as a preacher to instruct consciences about using the divorce law properly rather than wickedly and capriciously contrary to God's commandments. So what is the only exception for a Christian to get divorced in this verse? Immorality, yes. Sexual infidelity. Yeah. So there is one more reason given in the Bible. What's the other reason?
Desertion.
Abandonment or desertion, right?
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
I married a woman, and when I met her, she was married with 2 children.
Mm-hmm.
And we struggled with this. We wanted to be married. She was going through a divorce when I met her. And she was a new person here. It was learning fast. And I was surfing for churches. And I came here and we were struggling with, how do we do this? Can we get married in God's eyes? And now we were to be abandoned. Does the person who does the abandoning have to be an unbeliever? Which he was, and he had a girlfriend. So we felt convinced by what we read in the scripture that it was okay for them to continue the divorce and for us to get married. We did. We obviously had another baby.
Yeah. So EJ was asking about his situation where the husband of Shannon was
my first one.
Had left her and was dating somebody else at the time. Is that abandonment? You asked me. Yeah, that's adultery and abandonment, right? And how tightly you draw that line on adultery and abandonment.
And I think that has also been talked about with drugs and alcohol. I mean, somebody may state, but that with doing nothing about it and continuing in that can also be abandonment.
Okay.
Because there's, I mean, and I know there's all kinds of things, and there should be something tried, but I think at some point that's abandonment also, because you're
Right.
living in your sin.
What's their spouse ultimately? Mary mentioned alcohol or drugs that could be, you know, they're still living in the house and they're still maybe living off your paycheck, but all their time and energy is going to the drugs or the alcohol, right? So you'd hope they could work it out. Mike, did you have something to that point, or?
Well, I keep coming back in my mind is what God has joined together, let no man put asunder. But, after that.
Okay, yeah, God doesn't want to, Laura?
I just need something clarified. What is a sunder?
Asunder, that's a good question. It's a King James version, right? Let no man put asunder, tear apart, I think it means, to tear apart. Yeah, Mary?
Well, I just have a question, because you said here it says sexual immorality,
Mhm.
but in the NIV it says marital unfaithfulness, and that's kind of, it is a broader, I would think a broader statement, because marital unfaithfulness could be desertion.
Yeah, I think I'd have to look at the Greek word for that again, but I think it is connected to the sexual act,
But
not
that doesn't sound like.
marital unfaithfulness could be, I suppose, interpreted in other ways. Yeah, but I think it is primarily, yeah, Pastor Hotson? It is porneia, so that is sexual, yeah. Okay.
Pastor?
Just a second, go ahead.
You know, men deserted their wife because they didn't have any money, they didn't get a job, they couldn't support the family. So there was a lot of desertion.
In the 20s and 30s, men did that?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
so they deserted their wife because they didn't have any money?
To support the family.
So they just left them behind? Oh, that's terrible.
You read a lot of
Okay. Huh. What? They say that nowadays 70% of the women are the ones that are applying for divorce now. Yeah.
I believe it.
And there is, you know, and a lot of times the grounds aren't there necessarily, but you know, you have no fault divorce also, which I think has really hurt marriage, obviously, because you can have somebody that's completely at fault and then they get away with it in a sense that they don't have to suffer as many consequences. And they're the ones who are messing up the marriage, you know? So I don't know. Anyway, go ahead online.
Pastor, where does violence fit?
Violence could fall under desertion, I think, in that if somebody was being abused, and you know, you can get verbal abuse too, where somebody's yelling and demeaning, where they're not allowing you to live in the same household, even though they're not the ones that have left, they are causing you to leave by their abusive behavior. So I would probably put that under desertion. Although, you know, again, we're interpreting this a little looser than we used to, right? And I don't like there being easy divorces, so to speak. I want couples to try and fight for their marriage and not just to file for divorce. And
Divorce these days has just become so passe. It's why the whole getting into a relationship with someone and having premarital sex, everything that the Lord, if Paul says the best, if you think you're doing wrong, you're sinning.
yeah, if you're breaking your conscience, you are. There was a lot more stigma on divorce, obviously, back in the 60s, 70s, even in the 80s. But, you know, you feel bad for some of those people who were unlawfully divorced, and then they were stigmatized too, though, you know. My mom, I think it was her dad that left the family, and she had a real rough time because she came from a divorced family back in the day. That was a real, you know, tough thing. So, so it's kind of personal, although I never knew my grandpa. I knew my step grandpa, but I never knew my grandpa. I wasn't around, obviously, when any of that stuff happened. So
There's so many bad implications from it. When you're giving your kids the okay to say, well, I didn't get along with that one, let's get a new one.
yeah, your children see that too, right?
My parents divorced in 77, so.
Yeah, and you saw all that too, right?
So,
And it makes people fear marriage and only see the wickedness of it, you know, the way that can happen from it, and not see the blessings that
Paul
happen.
says that best too, if you can't stay faithful to one person, it's better not to have anyone at all.
Yeah. Let's see here. Where were we? Would these be good marriage rules for our government to enforce, that you can only get divorced for marital unfaithfulness or desertion? Our government would never do it. You even think about God with the Israelites in the Old Testament, he seemed to be more lenient in a sense. Not that he liked it, but he did say, I don't know, I hate to say it that way, but
There's so little said about it, though.
yeah, there's, but the way, give them a certificate of divorce, and then you see how they were practicing it in Jesus' time, is they could get divorced under even the Pharisaical law for almost anything and everything. A man could, right? And this is where Jesus is speaking against this. Yeah.
I divorce thee, I divorce thee, I divorce thee.
Yeah. That's a Muslim rule, is it? You say it 3 times, I think. Yeah. Mary, did you have something else?
Well, I was just going to say that in this case, it always refers to the husband. In those days, I guess the wife has never been really.
Right. Yeah. I don't see any. Well, actually, no, there's an example in the Old Testament of the prophet's wife who left him. Who was that? Hosea, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there was an instance there.
But there's very little.
Very little, right. So look at verse 32. What does it say happens to a woman whose husband divorces her? She becomes an adulteress, and that's where the translation is important. It may not sound right. If she's an innocent party, why would she be condemned for marrying someone else? Here's where we look at the different translation. A literal translation of the verse would be, except for marital unfaithfulness causes her to appear as an adulteress. So it's a passive verb, and anyone who marries a divorced woman is looked upon as an adulterer. So the idea is the perception that happens when you marry a divorced woman, then you're looked at in that society maybe as an adulterer, and Jesus is saying that shouldn't happen in a sense, but that's what happens. So he's not necessarily saying if somebody marries somebody, they're automatically an adulterer, but that's the way they're looked at by their society. Okay? Does that make sense?
Is that why in the Catholic Church you had to get an annulment so that that's that same idea.
That was part of it.
I married the wrong person.
Yeah.
Squelch this for me?
Yeah, years later. It doesn't work too hot in reality. It's you get an annulment, pay for that. Yeah. DJ.
In the study, where is it? It's in Matthew, right? Where is that where it says, I tell you that everyone who divorces his wife except for the fact?
That's so the way the EHV translates it is better, I think.
I'm looking for where it's at, so I can get it in line.
It's Matthew 5, 31 and 32.
Matthew 5, 31.
Yep.
Okay, that's what I was looking for. Thank you.
So God's word to the nation was kind of a pre-EHV translation. It kind of reflects the EHV. I tell you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the fact that she has been sexually unfaithful, causes her to be looked upon as an adulteress, and whoever marries a divorced woman is looked upon as an adulterer. So in the case Jesus is describing, the man sins by breaking his marriage on non-scriptural grounds. The wife was not guilty of marital unfaithfulness. The man who marries her is looked upon, he's stigmatized as an adulterer. Thus the man who divorces his wife for unscriptural reasons not only sins by getting an unscriptural divorce, but also by making her and the man she marries look like adulterers. So people will assume that she was the one who committed adultery, and that's why he's divorcing her. Okay, back in the day, I guess is what he's saying there.
I'm sorry, I was mixed up. For some reason, I was on 15 now.
Oh, yeah. 10 chapters ahead of us. So here's an illustration. Brian's wife had an affair. When he originally found out, he was crushed. She was very sorry. So he decided he'd forgive her and try to work it out. They lived together for another 2 months, and she became pregnant with his child. But after 2 months, he decided he just couldn't forget about what she had done or get over it, so he wanted a divorce. Could Brian get a divorce for a scriptural reason? Why or why not?
I asked this question last year, a similar situation, not for me,
Okay.
a friend. But I was told that this happens and they decide to either reconcile or not, that's where it starts again.
Yeah.
You don't get to have a get out of jail free card for the rest of the
Right.
marriage.
Right. It's not a get out of jail free for the rest of your marriage because she
Right.
had an affair.
He's
And-
already made the commitment, they are married.
Yeah, right. Yeah, when you're back living together and having sexual relations, you've made your decision, right? So you can't use that as an excuse year, 2 years down the line.
Well, they don't even need that today.
No, they don't. But what you do with your pastor, if your pastor's breathing down your throat, probably. So, yeah. So, what if Brian had come to you right after he found out about the affair? Would he have a right to get divorced? Yes, right? How would you counsel Brian, stay or go? Stay, right? Yep, yep. Yeah, if you say you forgave her, then you're going to have to suffer through the hurt of that, right? Yeah. All right, so we're on the same page there. Good deal. Luther says if the guilty party is humbled and reformed, the innocent party should let himself be reconciled to him and forgive him in Christian love. Sometimes there is no hope for improvement, or the reconciliation of the guilty one and his restoration to good graces is followed only by his abuse of this kindness. He persists in his loose behavior and takes it for granted that he is entitled to be spared and forgiven. I would not advise mercy for a person like that. Rather, I'd help to have such a person flogged or jailed. For one oversight is still pardonable, but a sin that takes mercy and forgiveness for granted is intolerable. So Luther likes to flog and jail people as often as possible. Yeah, it was popular back then. Is divorce always a sin? Well, on someone's part it is, right? Yeah. Often both contribute, but yes, there's always sin there. When Jesus is speaking of marital unfaithfulness, is he only referring to the sexual union? If your spouse just kisses another, is this grounds for a divorce?
You know, there's something, a big deal when you cross that line.
Yeah.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
And doesn't the word say the divorce is for sexual immorality? How is it worded?
Sexual immorality. Porneia is, yeah.
Kissing, I don't think is sexual immorality.
You don't think so? So your wife can go ahead and kiss somebody? That's not sexual immorality?
No.
But it's not grounds for divorce? Probably not. All right. Laura, what were you going to say?
Forgive it, Lord is forgiven.
Go ahead, Laura.
I didn't realize it was a common past practice, so, but my grandfather, when he kissed us, he had his tongue halfway down his throat.
Yeah, that's not right, right? Yeah. So that's, yeah.
I didn't realize that
Was wrong at the time?
yeah, I mean, because he's done it all.
Yeah. Yeah, that's not right. Yeah. George.
Kissing is going on, there's a lot more.
Yeah. So if they said that we're just kissing, usually there's more. Yeah. But
It's about the intention of the heart. The Lord knows your intention.
well, if you're kissing somebody in a sexual way, I'm not talking just kissing on the cheek, or even maybe a light kiss on the lips is, as a friendship thing. Yeah. AJ.
So my wife's in the closet at work making out with the chin, and I'm looking for the bathroom and open the wrong door. That's grounds for divorce.
I would think so. I mean,
Really?
I'm not, but you got to be careful that
Don't worry, I'm not getting divorced. I didn't catch it.
you didn't catch. You want this to be lifelong, and there's going to be sins committed against one another. You don't want to say, well, I get to get out of the marriage for this. You want them to work it out, right? So it's not, okay, I get to leave for this. You have to be careful of that kind of a mindset too.
When the Lord joins you together, you're supposed to be one.
Yes. Pastor.
Yeah, you have to make sure that you don't say that just because there's grounds for divorce doesn't mean that you should.
Right.
My dad, hey,
Yeah. Grounds for divorce doesn't mean you should get divorced necessarily.
I guess I'm a little passionate because early, my wife and I were newer Christians. We just got into Trinity. We were newlyweds. I went from house of one to a house of five. We're a couple of years in, we're gonna get divorced. You know, we were talking attorneys, and it was because of our growth here in Trinity and the counsel we got that we realized, you know, how wrong it was.
Yeah.
And it can work out. There was nothing like you read about today.
Yeah.
We just wanted the convenient out.
Yeah, and people think it's going to be easier to leave, but oftentimes 5 years down the road, they're happier than they were if they stuck it out.
Absolutely, and I will vouch for that.
Yeah.
I mean, when you finally realize God has a plan for you, and He really does set these things ahead, it improves marriage.
Absolutely.
And it's wonderful.
There's a thing about living righteously, and when you're bringing new souls into the world, there's endless consequences if there's strife.
Mm-hmm.
And that's dangerous.
Yep. Mary, what were you going to say?
No.
Oh, we good? Albrecht says, we also need to be reminded that lax laws and popular immorality don't make divorce and sexual sins permissible for a Christian. The laws of the state may express the will of the people, but as Christians, we want to submit to all of God's commandments. This is a difficult assignment in a corrupt society, but God will help and bless all who sincerely try. So God's laws are better than man's laws, and just because it's permissible by the law doesn't mean it's permissible by God. Okay, so are there any